Welcome. This podcast is an exploration into being human and what's possible when there's less attention on the noise in our heads. Warning: while listening to this broadcast, you may experience moments of deep peace, sighs of relief, personal insights, or long stretches of dead air. Do not be afraid. This is normal. Under the Noise with Wyn Morgan and Kate Roberts. Welcome to this week's Under the Noise with me, Wyn Morgan, and...
Hey, I'm Kate Roberts.
Delighted today to have a guest, George Pransky. And George is someone I met many years ago. And the one thing I remember in the first time I met him, I did not understand him. Didn't get him, thought he was out to lunch. And it's nice to know how minds can get changed, because that was in February 2012, so just over 9 years ago at the time that we're talking right now. Because I've never spent more time nor invested anything like as much as I have in spending time with George. And no one has done more for me understanding my humanity, nor impacted my work as George Pransky.
Well, that is a strong statement.
And a true one, George. So it's an absolute thrill for me to talk with you right now and to bring you to our listeners. So, George, if I remember correctly, you were a classical therapist around 45 odd years ago in Gestalt therapy, if I recall.
Well, it was a approach that this guy John Enright and I, two dear friends, we invented this approach, and we practiced this approach, and I was his intern, so I was in graduate school and learning this approach from John Enright, and the premise of it was that people's problems were stemmed from their history. But not the kind of history that you might think. We came up with these techniques that would highlight people's history and would these techniques would move them forward in their development. That was what we promised.
And what happened?
Well, at some point, I worked with John Enright, and then I was his partner, and before that I was his intern, and then at some point I kind of gave up on the psychology as a viable science, you might say. I just gave up on it. I saw people coming back, having problem A, and then they'd solve problem A, and then they'd have another problem that would consume them. And I just thought it was wall-to-wall problems, psychological problems. And I was very hopeful at the beginning, and I was very hopeless later in my life, because I just felt like it was just wall-to-wall problems. And at that time, I met my partner, John Enright, talked to me about meeting this guy named Sidney Banks. He apparently lived in Salt Spring Island. And I never heard of him, but I was amazed at how let me see how to say it, how the effect that John Enright had on Sidney Banks, even though he didn't hardly knew him. But John Enright had all this respect for this guy, Sidney Banks. So I was anxious to meet him, and I had an opportunity to meet him because and my wife Linda and I went traveled to Salt Spring Island and met him. And it was a very interesting meeting, because he was fascinated by what I was doing that was called therapy. And he said to me, "Well, George, talk to me about your therapy. What happens in your therapy?" I said, "Well, you know, I deal with people who have psychological problems, and I solve their psychological problems, and then that's the end of my my therapy." So he said, "Well, do you are you saying that they have psychological problems and then you solve those psychological problems?" I said, "Well, yeah, if I have an opportunity, I do." And so Sid said, "Well, so they have psychological problems, and then you solve the psychological problems, right?" I said, "Well, yeah, I mean, I suppose you could say that." He said, "Well, what would you say, George?" And I said, "Well, it's not that simple. You know, when people have psychological problems, it's not that simple to solve them." He said, "Well, how often do you solve them?" I said, "Well, Sid, it's you know, not very often." He said, "Well, what do you mean?" I said, "Well, it's hard to solve people's psychological problems. It's very hard, very difficult. You solve one problem, and then they have another problem, and then that solve that problem, and then they have a third problem." So he said, "Well, what are you saying? Are you saying you don't help solve people's problems? I said, well, not often. It turns out they're very, very hard to solve. They take some doing. So he said, well, when you talk to people, don't they get better as a result of talking to them? I said, well, it's not that simple, he said, because, people accumulate problems. They come up with this problem, and then they have another one. So he said, well, then how come you would say that you leave them and they're you help them or try to help them, and then they get embroiled in their problems? Why do you get them embroiled in their problems if you're trying to help them? I said, well, it's not that simple. I said, because people have been involved in the problems for a lot of time, for a long time before I knew them. So it's not the simplest thing to help them out. They said, well, what do you do with them in order to help them out? I said, well, I do all these techniques. He said, well, what about the techniques you do? I said, well, they're common techniques, and the idea of them is to get past their problems. So his energy picked up when I said that. He said, really? Yeah. He said, well, do you often get past their problems? I said, well, not really. He said, so what do you do for them? I said, well, I do the best I can. He says, I understand you. I understand you do by best, but when they leave you, do they still have problems? I said, yeah, they do. He said, so you're saying that you try to help them, but ultimately they end up with the same problems that you tried to help them with. I said, well, you make it sound like I don't really do much. I said, well, I'm just trying to understand what you do and how you help people with problems. Well, all of a sudden, I started feeling nauseous. Mm. And I felt like I was a fraud. So here Sid was, buying my story, and I felt like I was a fraud, that I was really not able to help people. And I thought that I was taking money out of false pretense. So I started feeling really bad about myself. And I started really bad about Sid. I had a really bad attitude about him. And I said to him, well, Sid, I know you're interested in what I'm doing. That's why you're talking to me. But I'm kind of confused as to how I'm supposed to help you. So he said to me, well, George, it's pretty simple. It seems to me, in order to help people, you have to be in a good state of mind yourself. So you have to find your enjoyment as a human being. He said, it seems to me that should be job one. And I said to him, well, my colleagues are themselves very unhappy. So I don't see how they're gonna find their happiness if they're already unhappy themselves. He said, well, what you're telling me is that they can't find their happiness because they don't know where to look for it. I said, well, you could say that. He says, I am saying that. I'm saying if they can't find their own happiness, how are they supposed to find someone else's happiness? I said, well, that's kind of a harsh statement that you're making, Sid. He said, well, is it true or not? I said, well, yeah. He says, there's some truth in it. I said, well, he said to me, well, George, it would seem to me that you would be an expert in happiness because that's your stock in trade. And I said, well, I'm really not an expert in happiness. I'm an expert in let me see how to say this. Yeah, I'm losing my bearings. You have to bear with me for a minute. My expertise isn't in mental health. My expertise is in mental illness. That's where I shine. Is I know how to diagnose people who are mentally ill. I know how to diagnose the specific problems that they present. That's what my orientation is. So Sid says, well, can't you find people's happiness? Can't you find the key to their happiness? I said, well, I haven't been trained in that. That's not my expertise. He says, well, it seems to me, George, that you're trying to, let me see. Seems to me that you're how to say it so good. Let me just stop for a minute. Okay. Well, Sid said to me, well, George, have you ever asked yourself why people find happiness so elusive? And I said, yeah, I have asked about that. And I think the reason it's so elusive for people is because they have their problems. And that's what their focus is in solving their problems. So he said to me, well, George, did it ever occur to you that people think they have problems, but the fact that they think that they have problems is their problem? So they're living in a world where they think they have problems. So they're making their problems be problematic. So I said to him, well, Sid, that's too simple an explanation, because people's problems are very complex, and it's my job to solve their problems. And even for me, it's a very difficult job. You make it sound like people, their only problem is that they're unhappy. I said, so he said, yeah, that's right. That's what I was saying. If the person wasn't unhappy, they wouldn't say that they had a problem. Well, to me, this was a ridiculous explanation. It was absolutely absurd. And I wasn't having it. So I complained to my wife Linda about him, and I basically said, this guy thinks that it's the easiest in the world to be happy. But if that was true, then you wouldn't have people with psychological disorders. He said, I live in the world of psychological disorders, And just because Sydney Banks thinks that's the only way to go, or just because Sydney Banks doesn't believe in psychological disorders, doesn't mean that that's not the way the world is wired up. We have people who have real psychological disorders. So Linda said to me, well, George, don't you think that what Sid's saying is that if you find your happiness, that accounts for something? That's a good thing. And I said, well, I don't want to argue with you, Linda, but I'll tell you, I think he doesn't know what he's talking about. So she said, okay. So I was driving by car to Oregon from California. And I was totally upset with what Sid was saying. And I started complaining about it. And he said to me, or Linda said to me, well, if you think he's full of shit, why don't you just ignore what he says? And I said, that's exactly what I'm going to do. I'm going to ignore what he said. Who cares what Sydney Banks says? Because, he's a layman. He has no psychological training whatsoever. He's a lay person. He wouldn't know about what it takes to have mental health if it bit him in the ass. Well, when I said that, Wyn, I had this feeling of relief. And I felt like I did when I was a child. That's the only I could say. I just felt this burden of life coming off my chest. And I knew that was the beginning of a new day for me. It was I turned a corner, and I went from there to talking to my partner John Enright, and I said to him, well, John, what if it was that simple? The people's core problem is that they're unhappy. And if they found their happiness, they would be cured. But what if it was that simple? And he said, oh, that's ridiculous, George. That's just a totally ridiculous view of human life. But I couldn't get it out of my mind, because I thought to myself, gee, if people were happy, they'd be happy. I mean, that's all they would need. And I said to John, John, what you are suggesting to me is very profound, because you're basically saying that if people found their happiness, that's all they need. So he really, at first, he thought I was a little bit crazy, but he was affected by how calm I was. So he'd known me as a very anxious person. I couldn't, uh, I, I couldn't sit down for more than 10 minutes because I was so nervous and anxious. And all of a sudden, I became this calm person. And John said, well, George, I don't know where you're coming from, but I know this approach that you're talking about is at least worth investigating. So he, essentially, he sponsored me. I was going to be his intern. He and I would go to Salt Spring Island, and we'd find out if there really was an answer there, as John suggested. And it took us about 9 months. We met with him for 9 months, and this other guy, Roger Mills, was learning for us too. And at the end of 9 months, we'd found our happiness. Now, I don't know how much of that 9 month was wasted, because we didn't really know what we were doing in the beginning. So I don't know how much time it would take if we just got with it and taught people about happiness. That's my story, Lynn. That was my 9 months of learning to be happy. And I had to break all these habits because I didn't understand how simple it was, and I just didn't know what I was doing initially. So I had to break a lot of very difficult habits. And the habits were basically me, without realizing, bumming myself out without realizing. And Sid would say to me, George, what are you bumming yourself out? What's going on with you? I said, well, I, I'm trying to be happy, but it's very, very hard. He says, well, don't try to be happy. Just be yourself and have your own journey. So he talked to me about the danger of techniques, the danger of thinking more than you know.
Mm.
So that's my story, Wyn. That's how I met Sydney Banks and how my life was very different after I started learning from Sydney Banks.
Yeah. Gorgeous to listen to. Gorgeous to listen to. Thanks, George. You know, as you were finishing that story, I remembered the first one-to-one you and I had when I had hired you and Linda and Bar Patterson to work with me for an extended period. And you and I had a conversation on, because I remember it vividly, it was September the 4th, 2015, day before my birthday. And you said, well, we're starting to work together for the next 6 to 9 months, when I'd like to get to know you. And I don't think you said a word for 40 minutes, and I just talked. And I was telling you all the things that I thought were wrong with me and my life.
Yeah.
You got up after 40 minutes and walked out, and you said, well, that's a hell of a story. You got up and you walked out, and I went, what happened there?
that can't be good.
Can a client be fired? I thought this will be a first. And about 20 minutes later, you sent me an SMS, a text message on my phone saying, hey, I'm going for a drive. I need to get a few things and pick up my grandson. Do you want to come? I said, sure. And it was great because within 10 minutes of that car journey, after we talked about what we're going to do in the afternoon and buy things for my birthday dinner the next day. And you said to me, that story, Wyn, here's what's striking to me. You don't see any of that as thought.
Wow.
And I looked at you as you were driving, and thankfully your eyes were straightforward on the road. But I was just like, yeah, that's true. That's true. I don't see it as thought. And you said something to me that I'll never forget. You said, so when you think of this specific problem, one of probably 3, 5, or 10 things I said to you in that 40-minute onslaught, when you think of this one, does it always feel the same when you think that? And I said, yes, it does.
Yeah.
And you slapped your hand on the steering wheel and you said, well, darn it, Wyn, if that's true, I should retire now. I've wasted the last 40 years of my professional life.
Oh.
And, and I laughed. I laughed because I heard so much in what you said. I thought, I trust him more than me. I knew you were on something. That was the start of me really seeing how everything I was feeling and all my problems in inverted commas were because I thought they were. And if it wasn't for my solidity and my thinking that my problems were real, I would be happy.
Oh. Well, that's a hell of a story.
And it's the best birthday present I could have wished for.
Yeah. Wow. So the thing that stood out to you, Wyn, is when you said that you really didn't know, you really didn't know what thought was.
Nope. I thought all of those things in my story to you were real.
Yeah.
I'd heard about Inside Out versus Outside In. I'd read a lot of Sydney Banks's books. I'd met you 3 or 4 times by then, probably more than that. But in that afternoon, it really shook me how much I didn't know and didn't understand. And then it's been a constant, time with you and Linda and lots of other wonderful people that's really helped me see what you saw in that 9 months.
Oh.
In Salt Spring.
Wow. I didn't really appreciate how that story was calculated to turn things around. Just that story from me, meeting Sid to going to going to yeah, I was there's so much hope in that story, and it affected John Enright. He was willing to be a student of mine just from listening to me and realizing how much I was learning. So he essentially gave up his whole life and became, my partner, just from the fumes. Just the smelling the fumes was enough for him. That's quite an extraordinary story, isn't it? And then your part of the story is extraordinary to me because you understood, you were taught what thought was, and then you thought, gee whiz, I don't even know what my own story is here.
And it took the charge out of the story.
Yeah. Took the charge out of the story.
Yeah. It made it as in if it was, so some things have happened in the past as opposed to I'm feeling it now.
Yeah.
That was the impact within a few days. I didn't really know it then. And that's, what I love about hanging out with you, whether it's listening to you in a group, whether it's having coffee with you or in the kitchen there or anything else, or watching a football game on TV, is what Sid said to you way back. You live your life in the way that you talk with people. And when I came up for a month a few years ago, I learnt at least as much just by hanging out and watching you and Linda live and living with you than I did from any kind of formal sessions. And I would just notice that you were the understanding of how thought works, how happiness works, how psychological health is a given in real time, every day.
Well, that's a strong statement. Well, I'm thinking that would be something if I could live up to that, because I know that it's true. it's true. People really do, without realizing it, have their thumb on their happiness.
Mm.
You can see it in young children. Easiest in young children. You don't have to teach them how to be joyful and how to laugh and how to enjoy themselves. It's built into their nature.
George, when you started to see how we work when you were with Sid, did you realize at the time how much you were changing? Or did that come later?
Well, it came. You know how I said I went to Salt Spring and then I went back to and was really bothered by what he said. And then I found my own peace.
Mm-hmm.
That's what all the magic happened. Between the time my two visits, that's where the magic happened. Because I saw that happiness was a default setting in human beings, and all they had to know was it is a default setting, and as soon as they know that, they can live in their happiness.
Mm-hmm.
So in a way, I understood the nature of life after I spent that time with Sid in Salzburg.
Mm-hmm.
To me, it's amazing that there's such that I could spend 9 months learning from Sid, and everything I learned from him, I was able to, convert to my own happiness. So there wasn't anything wasted in my journey. Just the idea of having free time and having relaxation, freeing my mind, all that was all new to me. That was part of my learning. And when I went back when I went back from the Salt Spring, just when I went back home to Oakland, I thought I'd found the fountain of youth, and the essence of enjoyment. So even though my finances were really bad at that time, I didn't care, because I figured it was just a matter of time before the world would knock on my door. And I haven't had any doubt about that since that time. Well, you guys, it's probably a time to go now. Yeah.
Yeah, it is. So we want to thank you so much, George. It's been an absolute joy as always to listen to you.
Well, I hope this went good. So, because it really matters to me about helping the two of you to understand this. So
it was gorgeous, George.
Yeah.
Absolutely gorgeous.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
All right. Well, listen, it was really nice talking to two of you. I'm sorry that my speech is a little broken up, but then that's what editing is for. So that's good. All right, you take care,
George. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome,
George.
Mm.
You've been listening to George Pransky, Kate Roberts, and Wyn Morgan on Under the Noise. Thanks very much for listening, everyone.
Thanks for joining us. We'd love for you to subscribe, rate, and review. If you have a topic or question that you'd like us to chat about, email Wyn or Kate at wyn@winning.co.uk and Kate at katerobertscoaching.com. Until then, enjoy what's possible under the noise.